Death wears a human face, and mercy bleeds. The rain fell like prayers no one answered anymore. Maya's fingers, wrapped in torn fabric that once resembled gloves, trembled as she counted the coins in her palm. $3.47. Everything she owned. Everything she was. She sat beneath the awning of an abandoned theater on Fifth Avenue, watching the city pulse with indifference. 23 years old, and the world had already forgotten her name. Her mother's voice still echoed in her memory. "You're too much trouble, Maya. Too sick, too weak, too expensive." Lupus had ravaged her body at 16. By 19, she was homeless. By 23, she was invisible. The cold settled into her bones differently now, not the cold of winter, but the cold of surrender. She'd stopped fighting 3 months ago. The shelter had turned her away that morning. They were full. The clinic wouldn't see her without insurance, and the man in the corner store had finally refused to let her use the bathroom. She was dying. She knew this with the clarity of someone who had already let go. That's when she saw him. He emerged from the rain like a figure from old cinema, tall, gaunt, his coat soaked and clinging to his frame like skin. His face was all shadows and angles, beautiful in a way that hurt to witness. But what struck Maya was his eyes, ancient, bottomless, filled with a sorrow that transcended centuries. He collapsed against the theater wall beside her. For several minutes, neither moved. The rain drummed its rhythm. The city roared past them, uncaring. Then, almost imperceptibly, the stranger began to tremble, not from cold, from hunger. His breathing grew shallow, labored, and his skin, pale as bone, seemed to translocate in the streetlight. Maya watched him die in slow motion. Without thought, without hesitation, she opened her palm and pressed the $3.47 into his skeletal hand. "Take it," she whispered. "Please." The stranger's eyes widened. His fingers closed around the coins as though they were made of light. For a moment, just a moment, his gaze locked with hers, and Maya felt something crack open inside her chest. Recognition, not of who he was, but of what they both were. Two souls abandoned by the machinery of the world. Why? His voice was gravel and velvet. "Because no one should die alone," she said. "Not even a stranger." He stared at the coins, then at her, his jaw clenched. "Do you know what you've given me?" "Everything I had. Precisely." He pressed the coins back into her palm, but his hand lingered. Where his skin touched hers, warmth bloomed. Electric. Impossible. "Then I will give you everything I have." Before she could speak, he pulled her close, and his breath, cold and ancient, touched her neck. Maya expected pain. She expected ending. Instead, she felt seen. For the first time in years, someone was truly looking at her, not past her, not through her, at her. "What's your name?" he whispered. "Maya." "I am Ezekiel." He pulled away but kept her hand in his. "And you have just changed the course of eternity." The rain continued to fall. Neither of them moved. In that moment, suspended between life and death, mercy and damnation, something ancient and irrevocable took root. Comment eternal if you'd trade your soul for love that heals. Chapter 2. The Blood and the Gift. Ezekiel's apartment existed in a pocket of the city that time had forgotten. 12 stories up, hidden behind unmarked doors, filled with the relics of centuries, oil paintings of faces that no longer existed, books bound in leather from ages past, candles that burned with flames the color of old gold. Maya moved through it like a ghost haunting her own life. "Sit," Ezekiel commanded, his voice still carrying that ancient weight. He brought her tea that tasted of honey and something darker, something that made her blood sing in her veins. Within minutes, her lupus pain receded. Not disappeared, changed, transformed into something she could bear. "What did you give me?" she asked, watching him move through the shadows with the grace of a predator who had learned long ago not to hunt. "A choice," he said. "But first, you must understand what I am." He showed her his wrists, scars that ran vertical, then horizontal, layered across centuries. "I was born in 1247, in a monastery in Prague. I was a monk who believed mercy was the path to God." He paused, his fingers tracing the ancient wounds. "I was wrong. I learned that mercy is the path to damnation." He told her of the plague year, when he had given his blood to the dying to ease their suffering. He told her of the curse that followed, how his gift became his prison, how he could sustain life but never end his own, how he watched empires collapse while he remained, unchanging, unforgiven. "I have lived 777 years, Maya. I have loved 17 times. Every one of them died while I remained." His voice cracked, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. "I stopped loving after the 17th. I stopped believing after the 100th year. I stopped hoping after 5 centuries. Then why did you take my coin?" Maya moved toward him, drawn by something primal and true. "Because you were the first person in 300 years to offer me something without knowing what I was." He cupped her face in his cold hands. "You offered me your last coin. You offered me mercy. You offered me the possibility that I was not yet beyond redemption." "Are you?" she asked. "That," he said, "is what we must discover together." He kissed her forehead, and where his lips touched her skin, she felt the weight of centuries pour into her. Every loss, every love, every moment of unending night. She gasped, pulling back. "I can feel you," she breathed. "I can feel all of it." "Yes," he said, "that is the gift. That is the curse. We are bound now, you and I. Your life is tethered to mine. Your heartbeat echoes in my silence, and I—" He turned away, unable to meet her eyes. "I can feel your pain as though it were my own. I can feel you slipping away from the world, and I cannot bear it." "Then don't," Maya whispered. "Save me. Make me like you." Ezekiel's entire body went rigid. "No, never. I will not damn you with my own damnation." "What if I'm already damned?" she asked. "What if the only redemption left for me is to spend eternity with someone who understands what it means to be forgotten?" He turned to face her, and in his ancient eyes, she saw the first spark of hope flicker like a candle in the dark. "Then we will be damned together," he said. "But not tonight. Tonight you rest. Tonight I hold you. Tomorrow." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow we decide if love can resurrect what the world has discarded." Outside, the city roared on, indifferent. But in that apartment suspended between time and eternity, 2 broken souls found shelter in each other's arms. Chapter 3. The Mirror and the Choice. 3 weeks passed like a dream or a fever. Maya could no longer distinguish between them. Ezekiel had given her a room filled with mirrors, all of them covered with deep burgundy cloth. "Not yet," he said, when she asked why. "When you're ready to see what you're becoming, the cloth will fall away." In those 3 weeks, she learned the grammar of eternity. She learned that vampires don't sleep, but rather exist in a state of profound stillness, their consciousness drifting through decades of memory like ships through fog. She learned that Ezekiel wept, not with tears, but with a grief that manifested as the slow dimming of the candles around him, as though his sorrow consumed light itself. She learned, too, that her own body was transforming. The lupus pain had not vanished. It had evolved. It still lived in her joints, her organs, her blood, but now it spoke a different language. It was not the language of destruction, but of awakening. Her nails had begun to darken at the tips. Her eyes, once brown, now caught the light and reflected it back like amber. And her hunger, her terrible, exquisite hunger, was growing. "How long?" she asked him one night, as they sat in his library surrounded by the ghosts of his past. Until you choose, he said. The transformation can take months or years. It depends on your will, on how much of your humanity you're willing to trade for eternity. And if I don't want to trade it? She asked quietly. Ezekiel was silent for a long moment. Then you remain as you are, bound to me, extended beyond your natural span, but still mortal, still aging, still capable of death. He turned to face her. And I will love you as you diminish. I will hold you as you fade. And when you finally leave this world, I will remain here, carrying the weight of another loss into another century. Maya felt her chest constrict. That's not fair to you. No, he agreed, but it is the only choice I will allow you. I will not make this decision for you. I will not drag you into my curse without your full consent. He reached for her hand, and where their skin touched, she felt the hum of his ancient heartbeat. So I ask you now, Maya, do you want to live forever? Or do you want to live truly, in whatever time remains? She stood and walked to the nearest covered mirror. Her hand trembled as she reached for the burgundy cloth. Not yet, Ezekiel said, but his voice was gentle. Why? She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. Why won't you let me see? Because the moment you see what you're becoming, the choice becomes real. The moment you see yourself as something other than human, the old life dies. He rose and approached her slowly. Are you ready for that death, Maya? She thought of the theater awning. She thought of the $3.47. She thought of a world that had already discarded her, and a man who had chosen to hold her instead. I'm ready, she whispered. Ezekiel pulled the cloth away. The mirror revealed not a monster, but a woman transformed. Her eyes blazed like embers. Her skin held a luminescence that seemed to come from within, as though she had swallowed moonlight. There was grace in her new form and power, and a terrible, beautiful hunger that made her want to weep. What am I? She asked her reflection. Mine, Ezekiel said, if you choose to be, forever. Maya turned to him, and in that moment, the last thread of her humanity didn't break, it transformed. It wove itself into something stronger, something that could withstand eternity. Then I choose you, she said. I choose this. I choose us. Ezekiel pulled her close, and as his fangs descended and hers followed, they tasted each other's blood for the first time. Not as predator and prey, but as two souls finally, irrevocably, finding their way home. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. Chapter 4. The Price of Eternity. The first kill was an accident. A man tried to rob them as they walked through the park at midnight. Ezekiel moved to shield Maya, but she was faster now, stronger, consumed by a hunger that transcended reason. The man fell. His blood sang against her tongue, and for a moment, just a moment, she understood why Ezekiel had called his curse a gift. Then she understood why he called it a curse. The man's memories didn't die with him. They poured into her consciousness like water through a broken dam. She saw his childhood, his poverty, his desperation. She saw the wife who had left him, the daughter he hadn't seen in 5 years, the fact that he had been planning to use the money from the robbery to buy medicine for his dying mother. She screamed and screamed until her voice shattered. Ezekiel held her as she wept blood instead of tears. This is the price, he whispered. This is why I have remained solitary for so long. Every life we take carries its story. Every death becomes our burden. We don't just consume blood, we consume souls. How do you bear it? She gasped. I don't, he said simply. I endure it. There is a difference. Over the following weeks, Ezekiel taught her the rituals of their new existence. How to hunt animals instead of humans, sustaining themselves on the blood of deer and elk in the forests beyond the city. How to move through crowds invisible, unnoticed, a gift that came from centuries of practice. How to love within the constraints of a curse that made every human connection a potential tragedy. But he also taught her something else: the weight of choice. "We are not slaves to our hunger," he told her as they sat in his library, surrounded by journals spanning 7 centuries. "Every kill is a choice. Every victim is a decision we make. This is why I have tried so hard to remain apart from humanity, not because I cannot control my hunger, but because I refuse to pretend that what we do is anything other than what it is: murder, refined, justified, but murder nonetheless." "Then how do you live with yourself?" Maya asked. "By remembering," he said, opening one of the journals. "By writing down every face, every name, every story, by refusing to forget the cost of my survival." He showed her pages and pages of careful handwriting, centuries of names, dates, final moments. "This is my penance. This is my prayer." Maya understood then that Ezekiel's greatest curse was not that he could not die, but that he could never forget. That the only way he had found to bear eternity was to document it, to witness it, to refuse the mercy of forgetting. She began to keep her own journal. By the end of the month, she had written 14 entries, 14 names of animals she had drained, 14 small deaths that sustained her existence. She thought of the man in the park, the one whose memories had poured into her consciousness, and she understood that his death had changed the calculus of her life forever. There would be no absolution, only the endless work of acknowledging what they were, what they did, and why they chose to continue existing despite it all. "I don't know if I can do this forever," she confessed to Ezekiel one night as they watched the city sleep from his apartment window. "Neither did I," he said. "But forever is not what we're promised. Only tonight. Only this moment. Only each other." He took her hand and pressed it against his chest, where his heart beat with the terrible slowness of an immortal. "As long as you're here, the curse becomes bearable. As long as you exist, I am not alone in the darkness." Maya leaned against him, and for a moment the weight of eternity felt lighter. But in the mirror across the room, her reflection showed her something else: the beginning of fangs, the deepening of her hunger, the slow transformation of her soul into something that would outlast cities, empires, entire civilizations. She was becoming what he was, and she was terrified she might be learning to enjoy it. Chapter 5. The Hunter and the Hunted. They were not the only immortals in the city. Ezekiel had warned her about the others, the Covenant he called them, a network of vampires who had rejected his philosophy of restraint and penance. They hunted openly, fed without mercy, and viewed the mortals around them as livestock rather than people. Their leader was Cassian. He arrived on a winter night, standing in the snow outside Ezekiel's apartment building, waiting. When they emerged, he was still there, immaculate in a dark coat, his pale hair catching the streetlight like spilled silver. His beauty was horrible and complete. "Ezekiel," he said, his voice carrying the accent of old Vienna. "Still clutching at your morality like a beggar with a coin? How pathetic you've become." "I have not come to fight you, Cassian," Ezekiel said quietly. Behind him, Maya could feel the tension in his frame, centuries of controlled violence held barely in check. "And yet you bring a fledgling to our city without paying tribute to the Covenant." Cassian's eyes shifted to Maya, and she felt his gaze like a physical touch, invasive, possessive, hungry. How delicious. A newly turned mortal, still reeking of desperation. "Tell me, girl, what did this ancient fool promise you? Redemption? Love? A path to eternity that doesn't involve becoming everything he secretly despises?" "Leave her alone," Ezekiel said. Or what? Cassian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Will you quote scripture at me again? Will you tell me how we're meant to suffer for the sins of our kind? You're a ghost, Ezekiel. A remnant of an age when vampires believed their own mythology. He circled Maya slowly, like a predator assessing prey. The girl, however, has potential. She could be magnificent if she were freed from your neuroticism, if she were taught to revel in what she is rather than apologize for it. Maya will never join you, Ezekiel said. We shall see, Cassian replied. He leaned close to Maya, close enough that she could smell the blood on his breath, human blood, fresh and full of terror. When he fails you, as he fails everyone, come find me. I can show you a world where being a monster is not a tragedy, but a triumph. Then he was gone, dissolving into the snow like a ghost. That night, Ezekiel told Maya the truth about Cassian. They had been turned together 600 years ago by the same vampire in Constantinople. But while Ezekiel had sought redemption, Cassian had embraced damnation. He had built the covenant as a sanctuary for those who viewed immortality as a gift rather than a curse, and he had made it his personal mission to convert Ezekiel to prove that redemption was impossible, that all immortals were, at their core, monsters. He's wrong, Maya said. Is he? Ezekiel asked quietly. I have killed, Maya. Not just in the first century of my existence, but recently. There are bodies in my past that I cannot justify, no matter how hard I try. There are people I have murdered, not out of necessity, but out of rage, out of despair, out of the terrible knowledge that I would never die, but they would. Am I so different from Cassian, really? Or am I simply a monster with a better conscience? You're different because you acknowledge the cost, Maya said. You're different because you chose me not as a conquest, but as a companion. You're different because... She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Because over the following weeks, Cassian began to hunt them. He left messages written in blood on their apartment walls. He intercepted their prey, desecrating the animals they had killed with rituals designed to corrupt. He even began to follow Maya during her rare trips outside, whispering temptations in her ear, showing her the thrill of taking human life without guilt or remorse. The worst part was that some of her listened. The part of her that had been dying on the street corner, desperate and alone, was beginning to wake up. That part wanted to feel powerful. That part wanted to stop apologizing for existing. That part wanted to become everything Cassian promised she could be. You're struggling, Ezekiel said one morning as they lay in the darkness of his bedroom, the windows blackened against the dawn. Yes, Maya admitted. You could leave, he said quietly. You could join Cassian. You could embrace what you are and stop fighting it. I would not stop you. Would you come with me? She asked. No, he said. I cannot. I am too old for such delusions. But you are young, Maya. You have centuries ahead of you. You should not spend them with someone who drags you toward suffering. Maya rose from the bed and moved to the mirror, the one she had finally allowed to be uncovered. The reflection stared back at her was no longer uncertain. It was powerful, radiant, dangerous. For the first time, she did not hate what she saw. I'm not leaving, she said, but Cassian is right about one thing. We can't run forever. He'll keep coming back. The covenant will keep coming back. Eventually, we have to make a choice, hide, surrender, or fight. Ezekiel sat up, and in his ancient eyes, she saw something ignite. The last ember of hope that he had thought long extinguished. What are you suggesting? He asked. I'm suggesting that we stop running, Maya said. I'm suggesting that we stop apologizing. I'm suggesting that we teach Cassian what it means to face someone who is damned not because she was cursed, but because she chose to become something greater. For the first time in 600 years, Ezekiel smiled, not with sadness, but with genuine, terrible joy. Chapter 6. The War of Souls. Cassian arrived at midnight on the winter solstice, bringing with him the full force of the Covenant, 17 immortals, each one a century old, each one hungry for blood and conquest. But Ezekiel and Maya were not alone. Over the past month, while Cassian had been circling them, they had been reaching out to the other vampires in the city, the ones who had grown tired of the Covenant's tyranny, the ones who believed, as Ezekiel did, that immortality should carry the weight of conscience. 12 came to their side. 12 broken immortals, each carrying their own grief, their own guilt, their own desperate hope that redemption might still be possible. The battle took place in the abandoned cathedral on the edge of the city, a space of stone and shadow, of fallen crosses and empty pews, where centuries seemed to gather and hover. It was not a battle of swords or violence, though there was violence. It was a battle of wills. Each vampire brought their memories, their pain, their accumulated traumas, and they hurled them at each other like weapons. Cassian's memories of Constantinople flooded the air, ancient bloodlust, the ecstasy of the hunt, the terrible freedom of embracing one's nature. Against them, Ezekiel and his allies brought centuries of restraint, of suffering nobly borne, of love maintained despite the weight of eternity. Maya fought in the center of the chaos, and she discovered something extraordinary. Her power did not come from strength or speed. It came from choice. Every time she refused to surrender to her hunger, she became stronger. Every time she chose compassion over cruelty, she became faster. Every time she selected restraint instead of violence, her entire being blazed with light that made even the ancient ones shield their eyes. She was, she realized, becoming something entirely new, a vampire born not from bite or blood, but from mercy. Cassian understood this before anyone else, and it enraged him. He moved toward Ezekiel with murder in his eyes, centuries of hatred finally given permission to act. But Maya was faster. She intercepted him, and for a moment they stood facing each other, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, the old world and the new one struggling for dominance. "Join me," Cassian hissed. "Stop fighting what you are." "I am not fighting what I am," Maya replied. "I am fighting what you want me to become. There's a difference." She struck. Cassian fell, but she did not kill him. Instead, she held him down and did something unprecedented. She showed him her memories, every moment she had spent on the street, starving. Every moment Ezekiel had chosen restraint instead of conquest. Every moment she had been loved, not because she could do something for someone else, but simply because she existed. Cassian screamed, not in pain, but in something far deeper. The sound of a soul confronted with the possibility that it had chosen wrong, lived wrong, become wrong. The other members of the Covenant, watching their leader fall not to violence, but to this strange new form of power, began to retreat. They dissolved into shadow and smoke, abandoning Cassian to his fate. He lay on the cathedral floor, weeping blood, confronted finally with the full weight of his own choices. "End me," he begged Ezekiel. "End me, old friend. I cannot bear this revelation." But Ezekiel simply looked at him with infinite sadness. "No," he said, "you will bear it. You will carry this moment into your remaining eternity. You will remember what it feels like to be seen, to be vulnerable, to be offered mercy you do not deserve. And perhaps, in some distant century, that memory will transform you as it has transformed her." They left Cassian in the cathedral, surrounded by fallen believers in a faith that had crumbled. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The city slept, unaware of the war that had just been won, not through violence, but through love. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. Chapter 7. The House of Redemption expanded. Years passed like seasons, each one bleeding into the next with the inevitability of tides. Ezekiel and Maya transformed his apartment into something unprecedented, a sanctuary for lost vampires. But it was not a sudden transformation. It began slowly, with a single refugee, a woman named Margot, who had been turned in 1889 and had spent the intervening decades as a weapon for the powerful, remade and unmade again until her sense of self had nearly dissolved entirely. She arrived on a March evening, half-starved and half-crazed, her mind fractured across the centuries she had accumulated. Ezekiel found her in the alley behind his building, collapsed against the brick, her dress torn and stained with blood that was not hers. He could have turned her away. After 6 centuries, he had learned the wisdom of solitude, of refusing to carry others' burdens alongside his own. But Maya saw her first. "She's like us," Maya said, kneeling beside the woman's trembling form. "She's damned and looking for a reason to exist. She is beyond help," Ezekiel said quietly. "That's what they said about me," Maya replied. "On that street corner, in the rain, dying of lupus and starvation. That's what everyone said, that I was beyond help, beyond saving, beyond redemption. And you proved them wrong." So Margot became their first charge, and from that single act of mercy, everything changed. They began by converting the upper floors of his apartment into private rooms. They established rituals, not religious rituals, but daily practices designed to help newly turned or damaged vampires find stability. Every morning at dusk, the vampires would gather in what had once been Ezekiel's private study. Now it was a kind of chapel, though no god was worshipped there. Instead, they practiced what Ezekiel called the acknowledgement. Each immortal would speak aloud one name of someone they had killed, one moment they regretted, one choice they wished they could unmake. Margot spoke her first acknowledgement 3 weeks after arriving. Her voice was barely a whisper, her hands shaking so severely that Maya had to hold them steady. "Eleanor," she said, "turned in 1901. I made her one of us, and then when she could not bear the hunger, I held her hand as the sun burned her alive. I did this because I was too cowardly to do it myself, and I needed to witness what I could not do to myself." The room was silent, not the silence of judgment, but the silence of understanding. Every immortal present had done something similar, had used another's death to avoid their own, had leveraged their endless life against another's finite existence. Ezekiel reached out and squeezed Margot's shoulder. "Eleanor's name is witnessed. Her death is acknowledged. Her life mattered because you loved her, even if you could not save her." This was the foundation of the House of Redemption, not forgiveness, for none of them believed they deserved that, but acknowledgement, the profound act of refusing to forget, refusing to minimize, refusing to pretend that their survival had not cost others their lives. Over the following year, more vampires arrived. Some came through underground networks, whispered recommendations passed through centuries-old connections. Others simply appeared at the door, drawn by stories of a place where immortals were not monsters, but simply beings struggling with impossible circumstances. There was Victor, a vampire who had been turned during the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. He had spent 175 years as a soldier, taking lives for causes that had long since crumbled into dust. His hands trembled constantly now, and he could barely look people in the eye without seeing the faces of those he had murdered stacked like cards beneath his consciousness. There was Lydia, turned in 1667, who had used her immortality to become a serial killer in every major city on the European continent. She arrived at the house carrying nothing but a leather journal filled with the names of her victims, 447 of them, meticulously recorded. She had not killed in 40 years, but the weight of those deaths had driven her half insane. There was James, a young vampire who had been turned only 5 years ago and who carried the particular agony of having murdered his own family in the first frenzy of his transformation. He had tried to end himself 17 times, but the curse of immortality had made even suicide impossible. He had arrived at the house with nothing but the hope that someone might teach him how to live with what he had done. Maya discovered that she had a gift for this work. She could sit with the newly turned and show them that their hunger did not define them. She had learned the language of cravings, of the constant pull toward violence, of the seductive whisper of the predator that lived beneath their skin. She knew this language because she lived in it every day, and she had learned to translate it into something meaningful rather than something monstrous. She could hold the hands of ancient killers and help them write their stories into journals of penance. She would sit with them for hours, sometimes days, as they recounted atrocities from centuries past. She would listen without flinching, without absolving, without offering the false comfort of forgiveness. She would simply bear witness, a younger immortal, still relatively new to eternity, holding space for the weight of endless time and endless guilt. She could look into the eyes of despair and reflect back the possibility of redemption. This was her greatest gift, because she was not so old that she had forgotten what it felt like to be human. She was not so removed from mortality that she could not remember the simple desperation of wanting to matter, of wanting to be seen, of wanting to believe that existence served some purpose beyond mere survival. Ezekiel watched her with awe and something like pride. "You have become what I could never be, he told her one evening as they stood on the balcony of the old manor house they had purchased in 1998, a grand Victorian structure on the edge of the city, crumbling and beautiful, perfect for a sanctuary of broken immortals. "What's that?" she asked, her eyes reflecting the stars that had begun to emerge in the darkening sky. "Hope," he said simply. "Not the naive hope of the young, but the hard-won hope of someone who understands exactly how much darkness exists and chooses to believe in light anyway." The house filled gradually with the sounds of life, or the closest approximation of life that immortals could achieve. The library became the heart of the sanctuary. Ezekiel had spent centuries collecting books, and now they lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Philosophy and psychology, art history and poetry, journals and confessions and memoirs written by immortals across the centuries. But the most important collection was the journals of penance, thousands of them now, each one a record of a soul attempting to reconcile with its own nature. "Why do you keep all of these?" A new arrival named Sebastian asked one evening, running his fingers along the spines of countless leather-bound volumes. "Because forgetting is the greatest luxury a monster can afford," Ezekiel replied. "And I refuse to be afforded that luxury. None of us should be. We should remember. We should carry the weight of what we are, what we have done, what we continue to do simply by existing." He pulled down one of his own journals, a particularly old one, bound in leather that had turned soft and fragile with age. "I have been writing these for 600 years. Every person I have killed, every moment I have doubted, every prayer that went unanswered. Every night I thought about stepping into the sunrise and finally, mercifully, ending." He opened the journal carefully, revealing page after page of meticulous handwriting, some passages in ancient Czech, others in Latin, many in modern English. Each entry was dated. Each one carried a name. "Look at this," Ezekiel said, pointing to an entry from 1347. "This is Katerina. I killed her in the first month after my own turning. I was so consumed by hunger that I didn't even know what I was doing. But I remember her face. I remember the way her blood tasted of fear and betrayal. I remember the moment when I realized what I had become." He turned the pages slowly, and Sebastian watched as 6 centuries of death scrolled past. But what struck Sebastian most was not the accumulation of deaths, but the evidence of Ezekiel's suffering. There were pages where the handwriting devolved into scrawls, passages that descended into incoherence, entire sections that appeared to have been written in blood rather than ink. "This is your punishment?" Sebastian asked quietly. "This is my witness," Ezekiel corrected. "Punishment implies that suffering can balance the moral equation. It cannot. Suffering only becomes meaningful when it is transformed into remembrance. The house became known in whispered circles within the immortal underground as a place of unprecedented sanctuary. Vampires who had heard of it through centuries-old networks, through the old families who guarded their lineages, through the rare immortals who maintained contact with their creators, through the legends that accumulated in the spaces between centuries, would sometimes appear at the door. They came in various states of despair. Some had been living as monsters for so long that they had forgotten the possibility of being anything else. Some were newly turned and traumatized by the realization of what they had become. Some were ancient and weary, carrying centuries of accumulated guilt that threatened to collapse them beneath its weight. And Ezekiel and Maya would take them in. They established a system of rehabilitation, though Ezekiel was careful to use that term only in the most cautious way. They were not trying to cure vampirism. That was impossible. Instead, they were trying to transform the lived experience of immortality from a curse of endless predation into something that approximated a meaningful existence. The first step was always the same: accountability. New arrivals were given a private room, blood from willing donors, humans who believed deeply in the sanctity of vampire existence and had chosen to contribute to the house's survival, and access to the library. They were then given a task: write down every person you have killed, every name you remember, every death you can still feel in your bones. Some vampires balked at this. Some insisted they couldn't remember, that centuries had erased the faces of their victims. But Ezekiel would simply smile sadly and say, "Then you are not ready yet. You can stay here, safe, until you are ready to remember. But you cannot heal until you choose to see what you have done." It was harder than it sounded, because choosing to remember meant choosing to feel. It meant allowing the accumulated weight of centuries of death to press down on your consciousness. It meant accepting that you were a killer, that your existence had been purchased with the currency of other lives, that no amount of suffering on your part could balance the equation. But those who stayed and did the work discovered something extraordinary. Remembrance could transform damnation into something resembling grace. Victor, the soldier from the Hungarian Revolution, eventually wrote a confession that ran to 47 pages, a detailed account of every person he had killed across 175 years of war. He described not just their deaths, but their lives. He researched what had become of their families. He discovered that one of his victims, a young Prussian officer, had left behind 3 children who had themselves lived long lives and had descendants numbering in the thousands. Victor began to visit the graves of these descendants, to tend them, to bear witness to the ways his single act of violence had rippled forward across generations. Lydia, the serial killer who had carried her 447 victims in a leather journal, finally began to break the silence around her murders. She had been keeping the journal as a kind of trophy, but under the gentle insistence of Maya and Ezekiel, she transformed it. She began to reach out to the families of her victims, anonymously at first, then eventually revealing her identity. She became a voice in cold case forums, pointing police toward unsolved murders she had committed. She could not undo what she had done, but she could ensure that her victims were finally, definitively, acknowledged as murdered rather than simply missing. James, the young vampire who had killed his own family, began to volunteer with newly turned immortals. His particular trauma, the horror of what he had done in his first moments of consciousness, made him uniquely suited to help others who were struggling with similar guilt. He would sit with them and say, "I murdered my mother, my father, my sister. I did this in a frenzy of hunger and transformation, and I cannot undo it. But I can witness your pain. I can help you carry it. And I can show you that even after committing the worst possible act, existence still finds a way to become bearable." The house began to develop its own culture, its own rituals, its own sense of community. There was a weekly gathering in the library where all the residents would share one memory from their human lives, not their immortal lives, but the brief, burning moments of existence before they had been turned. These memories became precious, almost sacred, because they were the only remaining evidence of the humanity that still lived, however deeply buried, within each of these creatures. Victor shared memories of his mother's hands making bread in a kitchen in Budapest. Lydia described the scent of her father's tobacco pipe, a smell she had spent 200 years trying to forget, but had finally allowed herself to miss. James talked about the way his sister had laughed, a sound so specific and particular that no one else in the world had ever replicated it. And with each shared memory, the boundaries between monster and human blurred a little more. Ezekiel watched all of this with an expression that shifted between hope and sorrow. He had lived 600 years believing that redemption was impossible, that monsters could not be transformed, that the best an immortal could do was acknowledge their nature and try to cause as little harm as possible. But watching Maya work her particular magic on these broken souls, watching them slowly begin to believe that their existence might serve a purpose beyond mere predation, he felt something shift inside his ancient heart. "Do you think they can be saved?" Maya asked him one evening as they walked through the house's gardens, a sprawling expanse that had once been overgrown and wild, but had been gradually transformed by the residents into something approaching beauty. Margot had planted roses. Victor maintained the pathways. Lydia had created a meditation garden with carefully arranged stones and flowing water. James had built raised garden beds and was experimenting with growing vegetables, a hobby born from nostalgia for his human life. "I don't believe in salvation anymore," Ezekiel said, taking her hand as they walked. "But I believe in transformation. I believe in choosing. I believe that a monster is only monstrous if they continue to choose monstrosity. And I believe that love, strange, complicated, impossible love, can sometimes be enough to make that choice easier." He paused, and they stood together in the center of the garden, surrounded by the evidence of broken immortals attempting to build something meaningful from the ruins of their endless existence. "You have given them something I never thought possible," he continued. "Not forgiveness, none of us deserve that. Not absolution, that would be obscene given what we have done. But you have given them the possibility of witnessing themselves, of acknowledging what they are, and of choosing day by day to be something slightly less monstrous than they were yesterday." The house grew. By the 5th year, there were 47 vampires living in or regularly visiting the sanctuary. Some stayed permanently, finding in the community a reason to continue existing across centuries yet to come. Others used it as a way station, a place to heal and find stability before moving on to build their own lives that involved careful feeding practices, deep community involvement, and a commitment to acknowledging the cost of their survival. A few, too broken to ever truly recover, remained in the house's deepest gardens, tended by those for whom gardening was a form of meditation and penance. One such vampire was a creature named Dimitri, who had been turned in the 19th century and had spent the intervening decades as an instrument of cruelty in the service of various powerful immortals. His mind had fractured under the weight of what had been done to him and through him, and he could no longer speak or maintain continuity of consciousness. But the residents of the house treated him with reverence, caring for his physical needs, singing to him during the long nights, sitting with him in the garden as though his suffering had profound meaning. "Why do we do this?" a new arrival named Catherine asked one evening, watching as Margot gently brushed Dimitri's hair and spoke softly to him in a language he could no longer understand. "Because he mattered once," Margot replied. "Because he was human before he was a monster. Because even if he can never recover, his existence, his pain, his memory, his presence becomes an active witness to what damnation truly costs." Chapter 8. The Eternal Vigil. Expanded. 23 years after the night Maya gave Ezekiel her last coin, they stood together on the balcony of the house as sunset painted the sky in shades of deep crimson and burnished gold, the kind of sunset that made even immortals pause in their endless existence and acknowledge beauty. The city sprawled below them, millions of lives pressing against each other, all of them unaware that in the old Victorian manor on the edge of their world, a quiet revolution was taking place. A revolution not of violence or conquest, but of transformation. A revolution that suggested that even the darkest souls might find their way toward light, if only someone was willing to hold space for their suffering. "Do you regret it?" Ezekiel asked her, as he did every year on the anniversary of their meeting. It was his ritual, this annual question, as though he still needed reassurance that their unlikely love story had not become a burden to her. "No," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of genuine contemplation. "Though sometimes I miss it, the simplicity of that night, when everything was just hunger and mercy and choice, when the world was small enough to fit inside a coin. And now? Now it's complicated," she said, smiling, a smile that contained both joy and sorrow in equal measure. "It's beautiful and painful and impossible, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." Ezekiel pulled her close, his cold arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that betrayed none of the predator that lived beneath his skin. They stood in silence as the city turned on its lights, as mortals returned to their routines, as the vast machinery of human life continued its oblivious march forward. The sun descended below the horizon, and the stars emerged, ancient light traveling across incomprehensible distances to reach their eyes. "Cassian sent a letter," Ezekiel said quietly. Maya tensed. Cassian had not been mentioned in years, not since the night of the battle in the cathedral, since the night Maya had forced her memories into his consciousness and revealed to him the possibility of redemption he had spent centuries running from. "What did he say?" she asked. "He has established his own house," Ezekiel replied, "in Vienna. He is trying to replicate what we have done here. He has taken in 17 vampires so far. He writes that they are struggling, that the work is harder than he anticipated, that some days he does not know if any of this is meaningful." Ezekiel paused, and Maya could hear the emotion trembling beneath his carefully controlled voice. "He also wrote that he thinks of you often, that the memory of what you showed him, the sight of mercy, the possibility of transformation, has become the only thing that keeps him from returning to his old ways. He calls you his redemption, even though you have never forgiven him, even though you have never suggested that what he did in his centuries of cruelty might be excusable." "Forgiveness isn't the point," Maya said quietly. "I don't think it was ever about forgiveness. I think it was always about the choice to see him as something other than the monster he had become. I think it was about showing him that he was still capable of change, even if change meant carrying the weight of his own guilt for centuries more." Below them, in the library, the house's residents were gathering for the evening acknowledgement. Victor had begun to read aloud from his 47-page confession, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was recounting. Lydia was preparing the leather journal that contained her 447 names, planning to spend the night adding new details to each entry. Small moments she had remembered, flowers that had been growing where each death occurred, weather patterns that had seemed significant at the moment. James was helping Margot with a new arrival, a vampire named Sophie who had been turned in 1952 and had spent the intervening 73 years in complete isolation, believing herself to be alone in the world. Her initial reaction to the house had been suspicious, almost hostile, but James, with his particular gift for understanding guilt, had already begun to help her believe that existence might be bearable. In the gardens, volunteers were setting up for the evening, humans who had chosen to become part of this strange community. Some of them served as blood donors, but most simply offered their presence, their labor, their willingness to work alongside immortal creatures in service of something larger than themselves. There was a psychologist named Dr. Chen who had arrived at the house 3 years ago and had become indispensable in helping the vampires understand their own trauma. there was a priest named Father Michael, who had come seeking something beyond the confines of traditional religion and had found in the house a kind of spiritual practice that transcended denominational boundaries. There was a writer named Elena who was documenting the work being done in the house, creating a record of transformation that she believed might someday help the world understand that redemption was not a matter of religious grace, but of committed choice. Elena asked me yesterday if she could publish the work, Maya said. Not under real names, obviously, but a fictionalized account of what we do here. What did you tell her? Ezekiel asked. I told her that she should ask everyone who lives here, that this is not our story to tell alone. It belongs to all of them, to every broken soul who has chosen to stay and do the work of transformation. Elena had indeed asked, and the responses had been varied. Some residents had been enthusiastic, seeing publication as a way to bear witness to their journey. Others had been cautious, worried about exposure, frightened of what might happen if the wider world discovered the existence of their sanctuary. A few had refused entirely, needing to keep their story private. But gradually, a consensus had formed. The story should be told. Not to glorify what the house did, but to suggest to anyone who might read it and feel similarly broken, similarly damned, that transformation was possible, that it was never too late to begin the work of acknowledgement, that even centuries of darkness might eventually yield to something resembling grace. Elena was now in the process of writing a manuscript. She had conducted hundreds of interviews with the residents. She had reviewed thousands of pages from the journals of penance. She was attempting to capture not just the facts of transformation, but the emotional truth of what it meant to choose redemption when damnation felt inevitable. Do you think she will capture something true? Ezekiel asked Maya. I think, Maya replied carefully, that she will capture something that matters. Whether it is true in an absolute sense is perhaps less important than whether it resonates with people who are struggling with their own darkness. As if summoned by their conversation, Elena emerged onto the balcony, a petite woman in her late 50s, carrying a notebook and the particular expression of someone perpetually in the midst of trying to understand something just beyond her grasp. I've been thinking, Elena said without preamble, about how to frame the ending. The house will continue, obviously. There is no final resolution, no moment where you can say, redemption achieved. But I wonder if there should be a moment in the narrative where we acknowledge that transformation is ongoing, that it never ends, that every day, each resident makes the choice again to be less monstrous than they were yesterday. That is exactly right, Ezekiel said. That is precisely what we are attempting to do here. Not to achieve redemption, but to practice it, day after day, night after endless night. Elena nodded and disappeared back into the house, already reorganizing her understanding of the narrative arc. As night deepened, Ezekiel and Maya remained on the balcony. More residents began to emerge into the gardens, the evening acknowledged complete, their emotional labor for the night temporarily concluded. They moved through the darkness like shadows themselves, some alone, some in pairs, all of them engaged in the quiet work of existing. Victor sat on a stone bench and allowed himself to simply breathe. For a soldier who had spent 175 years taking lives, even breathing had become a kind of meditation. Lydia watered the roses she had planted, each one named after one of her victims. There were so many roses now that they had begun to cascade across half the garden. A living memorial to a woman's centuries of cruelty transformed into horticultural care. James played a guitar that one of the volunteers had brought him, a human instrument producing sounds that seemed to travel across the boundary between life and death, between damnation and grace. Margot sat with Dmitri, as she did every evening, simply holding his hand while speaking softly about memories, hers and his, both real and imagined. Sophie, the newest arrival, walked slowly through the garden paths with Father Michael, beginning to tell him about the isolation of her 73 years, about the belief that she alone existed in the entire world, about the shock of discovering that she was not, in fact, alone. Catherine, who had been at the house for only a few months, stood at the garden's edge and wept. Finally, for the first time since her arrival, allowing herself to feel the weight of what she had done across her century and a half of existence. And in the library, scattered throughout its vast chambers, dozens of journals lay open, confessions and memoirs and records of transformation, each one a voice crying out into the darkness. I was here. I mattered. My suffering means something. I choose today to be less monstrous than I was yesterday. Every immortal was once someone who chose not to die, Ezekiel whispered to Maya, echoing words that had become something like a mantra for the house. And some of them, Maya replied, have chosen to become something more than monsters. They stood together as the night deepened, two souls suspended between life and death, damnation and redemption. The city slept below them, unaware. But in the house, in its library and gardens and countless rooms, the work of transformation continued, not finished, never finished, but always ongoing, always present, always possible. Because love, once chosen, cannot be unchosen. It must be tended, nourished, and witnessed into being, night after endless night after eternal night.